The sun had already sunk behind the low Nevada hills, leaving the sky washed in fading blue when Harland Creed approached the dusty outskirts of Dustwater. He sat upright in the saddle, despite the stiffness in his shoulders, the long week of hauling freight still weighing on his muscles. His horse moved at a steady, unhurried walk, hooves tapping over the packed ground in a familiar rhythm. Harland had taken the job because winter was creeping closer each day, and every coin mattered. His cabin, a good 20 miles north, needed patching before the first real cold arrived. All he wanted tonight was to collect the $5 owed to him and buy enough nails, flour, and lamp oil to last the month. That was his only reason for riding into town, nothing more. But as he entered Dustwater, memories he tried not to revisit pushed up from the edges of his mind. His younger cousin lying still in the dirt years ago, the moment that ended Harland's days as a wagon guard. Even now, that memory shadowed him whenever he passed through towns filled with loud saloons, strangers' eyes, and unpredictable tempers. Harland dismounted near the row of hitching posts, looping the reins carefully over the worn wood. He paused a moment, breathing in the thick mixture of dust, wood smoke, and whiskey that hung around the saloon. The tension in his shoulders stayed high, a natural habit after years of working the trail. He pushed through the swinging doors, stepping into a room filled with heat, smoke, and voices raised louder than necessary. Men crowded around tables, some laughing too loudly, some cursing their luck at cards, others drinking more than they could stand. Harland moved aside as two drunken ranch hands stumbled past him, then scanned the room slowly. His eyes found the younger brother, the one who was supposed to pay him, slumped at a card table, sweat on his forehead and his coin pile shrinking fast. Harland approached the table without speaking, waiting silently until the man finally looked up with guilt written across his face. Harland didn't need threats. His steady presence usually did the work on its own. "You have my money?" Harland asked, voice calm but unyielding. The younger brother swallowed hard and shook his head before pointing weakly toward the bar. "He's got it now," he muttered, refusing to meet Harland's eyes. Harland followed the gesture. At the bar stood the older brother, posture slouched, a half-empty bottle hanging from his hand. Behind him stood a young woman, her hands clasped together tightly, shoulders trembling in a way Harland couldn't immediately decipher, cold, fear, or both. He approached with quiet steps, careful not to provoke a man too drunk to think clearly. "You owe me $5, Harland said evenly. The older brother blinked slowly, then let out a short, uneven laugh, the kind that came from someone who had long stopped caring about consequences. $5? He repeated, slurring the words. "You won't see a damn coin." Harland's expression didn't change. "I worked for it," he replied. The older brother smirked, reached behind him, and yanked the young woman forward. Under the lantern's flickering light, the woman's condition became painfully clear. Her dress was torn along the neckline, ripped low enough to expose bruised skin across her chest and ribs. Her legs were bare from the knee down, feet scraped and dusty, ankles wrapped with thin, raw marks that spoke of rough handling. Her hair hung in tangled strands across her face, but she didn't try to fix it. She simply endured. "Take her as payment," the older brother said, shoving her closer. "She'll cover whatever you're after." Her breath caught, but she didn't resist. She only tried to steady herself against the bar, clutching the torn fabric to cover what little she could. Harland's reaction was instant, a controlled anger rising low in his chest, the kind he had learned to manage through hard years. Memories of broken people he'd seen after raids, the kind left behind when no one cared enough to help, pressed into his thoughts. But he kept his voice calm. "I'm not taking a woman for payment," he said. The older brother shrugged and took another swig from his bottle. "Then you're walking out empty." Harland glanced at the woman, Mira, though he didn't yet know her name. Her eyes rose slowly to meet his, dark and swollen at the edges, but steady, not pleading. When the brother shoved her again, she flinched like someone who had been struck too many times, expecting Harland to hit her too. That reaction struck him deeper than the bruises he could see. She waited, breath held, bracing for whatever choice he made. Harland didn't want responsibility. He didn't want to bring trouble into his quiet life. But he also couldn't walk away and leave her standing in a place where men treated her like an object to trade. So he reached into his coat, withdrew the coins he had earned, and placed them on the bar one by one. "This settles the debt," he said. "She walks out the door with me." The bartender nodded, weary of the scene. She should go, he muttered. This place has taken enough from her. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying a faint bite that hinted at winter's approach. Mira stepped out beside Harland, holding his coat tightly against her torn dress, as if the thin fabric alone could shield her from everything she had endured. Her breaths came unevenly, her ribs shifting with each inhale, but she stayed close to him as though distance might pull her back into danger. The street was empty, except for a stray dog rummaging through a broken crate. Harland watched her carefully, noting the way she kept her eyes lowered, unsure whether she was freed or simply transferred to another fate. "You're safe outside that place," he said softly. "You owe me nothing. I paid the debt to let you walk out." She nodded faintly, though her voice seemed locked somewhere deep inside. When she tried to mount the horse, pain tightened her features. Harland stepped in, placing steady hands at her waist to help her up. She didn't resist, but her body flinched from reflex, not mistrust. Harland mounted behind her, keeping a respectful distance while guiding the horse away from the saloon. The wind brushed through her tangled hair, lifting strands from her bruised cheeks. She leaned forward to lessen the pressure on her ribs, gripping the saddle horn with trembling fingers. Harland let the silence stretch, allowing her space to gather herself. The lanterns of Dustwater faded into tiny specks behind them, swallowed by the dark. Mira remained rigid, her shoulders rising with each careful breath. Harland slowed the horse, knowing every jolt hurt her. 10 minutes passed without either speaking. The scent of sage drifted in the breeze, mixing with the distant call of night insects. He watched her subtly, not wanting to alarm her, but he noticed how she fought to stay awake, her jaw tight with silent endurance. "Can you hold on a little longer?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her voice cracked when she answered, "Yes." Yet the effort beneath that single word revealed how exhausted she truly was. As they rode deeper into open land, Harland noticed her bare feet dangling above the stirrups. The thought of her standing on the saloon's splintered floor without shoes made something inside him twist sharply. He shrugged off his trail coat with one hand and draped it across her legs. She looked at the coat in surprise, her fingers curling into its folds. She didn't thank him aloud, but the small exhale she released was all the acknowledgement he needed. After a mile, he finally asked the question that had been sitting on his tongue. "You were with those men for how long?" Mira hesitated, gathering courage to speak truths she had buried. "Months," she whispered. "My brother, my real brother, lost me in a card game. After that, the saloon kept me." Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was cold, quiet, the way truth sounded when it had been repeated too many times inside her own mind. Harland's jaw tightened, his grip on the reins firming, but he kept his anger controlled. Showing it too strongly might frighten her. "Did they hit you tonight?" Harland asked, not out of pity, but to understand what she was enduring. She looked straight ahead. "They grabbed me. One shoved me into a wall when I asked for water." She spoke the words like facts, not complaints. Harland shifted in the saddle and she stiffened instinctively, thinking he might reach for her, but all he did was adjust his hold on the reins. "You're not going back there," he said, not a promise, but a certainty. Mira turned her head slightly, the moonlight catching the bruise along her cheekbone. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You could have walked out." Harland didn't answer immediately. He had asked himself the same question. He wasn't a man who went looking for trouble. He wanted to gather supplies and return to his quiet land. But the way she had looked at him in the saloon, silent, exhausted, resigned without begging, unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. "You shouldn't have been handed to anyone," he said. "I couldn't leave you in a place like that." The trail led them toward a shallow creek, its water glimmering faintly under the thin sliver of moon. Harland stopped the horse and helped Mira down, catching her before she stumbled. Her feet touched the cool dirt, and she steadied herself with small, shaky breaths. He handed her his canteen and she drank slowly, pausing between sips as though she wasn't accustomed to drinking freely. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked down, avoiding his eyes. "Do you have family anywhere?" Harland asked. "No," she said softly. "No one." He nodded, absorbing her answer. The land around them lay quiet, open, and far removed from Dustwater. Harland thought of his own cabin, a simple shelter, barely enough for one man who valued silence over company. "We'll reach my cabin by dawn," he said. "You'll rest there." Mira's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "You're taking me with you?" He met her gaze evenly. "It's the safest place I know." She looked down at her bruised feet and let out a breath, equal parts fear and fragile hope. Harland didn't press closer. He simply picked up the reins and held out his hand to help her back onto the horse. This time she hesitated less, trusting the steadiness he offered. They rode again, the darkness stretching around them. Mira held the saddle horn tighter on every small bump, her breath catching when pain struck her ribs. Harland felt every flinch, small, sharp reminders of what she had endured. When the breeze swept her hair aside, he saw her expression soften slightly, not from comfort, but from the unfamiliar quiet of being unhurt, unshouted at, untouched by cruelty. Gradually, her posture eased, not trust, not yet, but something near it, an acceptance of safety she didn't fully understand. Far ahead, Harland saw the faint silhouette of cottonwood trees marking the edge of his valley. The land grew quieter, the road narrowing between ridges. Mira lifted her chin slightly. "What kind of man are you, Harland?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. He didn't turn his head. "One who doesn't take what isn't mine," he said. "One who doesn't abandon someone who needs a way out." They kept riding, the silence settling around them like a thin blanket, fragile, yet real. Harland felt the shift between them, a quiet recognition that their paths had already intertwined in ways neither had expected. Mira leaned forward, steadying herself as the horse climbed a gentle rise. The moonlight touched her face enough for him to see she wasn't crying, she wasn't breaking. She was simply trying to understand a world where someone helped her without expecting anything. They reached the valley's shadow, where the night grew deeper and the land more private. Mira exhaled, her breath trembling slightly. She didn't know the future waiting in the cabin ahead, but she knew one thing with certainty. It was the first place in months she would enter by choice, not force. And Harland, without either of them saying it aloud, knew he was no longer riding alone. The valley opened into a quiet stretch of grassland, broken by clusters of cottonwood trees swaying gently in the night breeze. The faint outline of Harland's cabin appeared, small, sturdy, barely visible from the main trail. Mira studied the shape intently, as if trying to decipher the intentions of the man bringing her there. Instead of fear, curiosity softened her posture. "That's your home?" she asked, her voice careful. "Yes," Harland answered. "It's simple, but it's mine." She looked at the structure again, seeing no signs of chaos, no shadows of men waiting inside, no scent of whiskey or danger, just quiet. "You lived alone for years?" she asked. Harland nodded. "Didn't plan on it. Life just went that way." Those words revealed more than he intended, but Mira heard them clearly, the weight of loss in a man who had learned to survive through silence. When the horse stopped near the small corral, Harland dismounted and held his hands out to help her down. Mira tried to stand on her own, but pain shot through her ribs and she swayed. He steadied her, his grip gentle but firm. Once her feet touched the ground, she looked down in embarrassment. "I don't have shoes," she murmured. Harland didn't hesitate. "I'll get you a pair." He led her onto the porch, where she traced her fingers along the rough railing, grounding herself in the unfamiliar safety of the space. Harland returned with a pair of old leather boots. "They might be big, but they'll do." Mira slipped them on, surprised by how foreign the simple comfort felt. "You weren't planning to live alone forever," she said softly, repeating his earlier words. "What kept you out here?" Harland looked toward the dark horizon. "I lost someone," he said. "My cousin. I failed him, though I was supposed to bring him home." His voice didn't shake, but the sorrow in it was unmistakable. Mira lowered her eyes respectfully. "Losing someone changes everything," she said quietly. He nodded. "It does." She hesitated before speaking again. "I wasn't meant to end up in that saloon. My brother, he wasn't always like that. After our parents died, he changed. He gambled everything. Then he gambled me." Her voice tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "I used to sew dresses, decent work, honest work, before everything fell apart. Harland listened without interrupting, offering neither pity nor judgment. He simply absorbed her words like someone who understood how quickly life could collapse. "Inside is warm," he said, gesturing to the cabin. "You can rest there." The door creaked softly as he opened it, letting warm lamplight spill into the night. Mira stepped in cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. A stove in the corner, a bed against the far wall, a small table with 2 old books beside it. The place felt lived in, but not lonely in the way she expected. "You can take the bed," Harland said. "I'll sleep near the fire." She paused, struggling to understand the offer. "You're not expecting anything in return?" she asked carefully. The question hung heavy in the air. Harland's answer was immediate. "No. You're here because you needed a way out. Not because I wanted something from you." Mira's breath trembled, the truth of his words striking her deeper than she anticipated. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the coat around her shoulders. She watched Harland hang his hat on the wall, his movements calm and intentional. The fire crackled softly, warming the small room. Exhaustion finally settled into her bones. She lay back slowly, eyes drifting toward Harland as if making sure he wouldn't change suddenly. He sat in the chair near the stove, keeping a respectful distance, but staying close enough for her to feel protected. "Thank you for not leaving me there," she whispered. "You're safe," he replied. "Rest." Mira closed her eyes, her breathing easing into a slow rhythm, the tension in her shoulders finally loosening. She fell asleep not from collapse, but from the unfamiliar comfort of safety. Harland remained awake, staring into the fire with thoughts swirling like embers. He had taken her from Dustwater, but he didn't yet understand what danger might follow. Dawn seeped through the window hours later, pale and gentle. Harland stood quietly, his boots already on, ready to face whatever might come. Outside, the morning air was crisp, coating the grass in a fine layer of frost. He washed his face at the pump, letting cold water steady his thoughts. He would need a clear head, because trouble rarely stayed buried. Inside, Mira stirred slowly, waking to the soft creak of the door. For a moment, disorientation flickered across her face. Then she remembered where she was, and her shoulders eased. The quiet inside the cabin felt real, safe, something she hadn't felt in months. She rose cautiously, one hand pressed to her ribs. Harland entered again, shaking the cold off his coat. She stepped back instinctively, then stopped herself. Her eyes met his briefly, searching for any shift in his expression. "Morning," he said, voice low and steady. "Did you sleep at all?" She nodded. "A little. It was the first time I didn't wake up scared." Harland set a tin cup on the table. "I'll heat water. You can wash up if you'd like. There's clean cloth in the trunk by the bed." Mira looked toward the trunk, noticing how carefully everything in the cabin had been kept. "Do you need to go back to town today?" she asked softly. "Not yet," he said. "Not until I know how things stand." His tone hinted at more, but he didn't say it aloud. Mira swallowed. "Do men like them? Usually let someone go?" Harland looked at her honestly. "Not always, but Dustwater's full of men who forget things once they've had enough to drink." It wasn't a perfect reassurance, but it eased a fraction of her fear. "What happens to me now?" she asked quietly. "I don't want to be a burden." Harland shook his head. "You're not a burden. You're someone who needed protection, that's all." Mira turned her gaze downward, struggling to process the simplicity of his words. She had spent months being treated as something to own, not help. Harland lit the stove and placed a pot of water on it. The warmth began filling the cabin again. Mira walked to the trunk, lifting the lid to reveal old clothing folded with care. She lifted a shirt and pair of pants, both smaller than Harland's size. "These clothes," she asked softly, "were they his?" Harland's eyes softened. "Yes, my cousin's. I kept them because throwing them out didn't feel right." Mira touched the fabric gently. "If you'd rather I not—" "It's fine," he said. "They're better used than forgotten." She stepped behind the hanging blanket to change, and Harland turned away, tending to the stove to give her privacy. When she stepped out again, the oversized shirt hung loosely around her, covering her more fully than anything she'd worn in months. Harland glanced at her, brief, respectful, and nodded. "That suits you better." Mira sat down carefully. "You think we're in danger?" Harland didn't sugarcoat the truth. "I need to know if anyone left Dustwater last night. If they did, then trouble's already on the way." Mira tightened her grip on the shirt's collar. "What should I do while you're gone?" "Stay inside," he said firmly. "Bolt the door. Don't open it unless you hear me call your name." She nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. He stepped toward the shelf and picked up a hunting knife, holding it out, hilt first. "Keep this with you. Don't hesitate if someone tries the door." Mira stared at the knife, unsure. Then she wrapped her fingers around it, steady but trembling. "I won't freeze," she said quietly. Harland met her gaze. "Good." He stepped outside, and Mira watched him through the window as he saddled the horse. She saw the way he scanned the horizon, every motion careful and practiced. She held the knife tighter, her breath shallow but steady. As Harland rode toward the ridge, the valley stretched wide and silent around them, and for the first time in a long time, Mira allowed herself to feel the smallest flicker of hope. Fragile, trembling, but alive. Harland guided his horse toward the ridge with a steady pace, the early sunlight stretching across the valley in thin, pale streaks. Every few steps, he scanned the horizon, the creek bed, and the rocky slopes, searching for signs that didn't belong. Danger, he knew, rarely announced itself loudly. It crept in quietly, usually from the place a man least expected. When he reached the top of the ridge, he dismounted and crouched beside a cluster of sagebrush. The ground showed no recent tracks, no fresh hoofprints, no boot marks, no broken branches, just the familiar scars of his own visits from weeks earlier. It eased a fraction of the worry in his chest, though not enough to dismiss the threat entirely. He looked toward Dustwater in the distance. The town appeared still, almost harmless, but Harland knew better. If the men there woke drunk and angry, they might decide Mira was something worth reclaiming, not because they valued her, but because men like them hated losing anything they believed they owned. Inside the cabin, Mira sat near the window with the knife resting across her lap. The oversized shirt she wore draped softly against her bruised form, but nothing about her posture was relaxed. She kept her gaze fixed on the valley outside, watching for anything that moved. Being alone in an unfamiliar room tightened something inside her, stirring memories she wasn't ready to face. But she held the knife firmly, not out of confidence, but because Harland trusted her with it. That alone made her steady her breath. She studied the items on the table, the folded blankets, the tin cup, the bag of flour, and tried to understand the type of man who kept simple things in such careful order. She had never been offered a safe space without a hidden cost. Every quiet minute felt fragile, surreal, like something that might vanish the moment she blinked. A sudden thud outside made her heart leap. She froze, knife poised, breath caught in her chest until she heard his voice. "Mira, I'm back." Relief crashed through her so quickly her knees weakened. She placed the knife on the table, though not out of reach, then unbolted the door with trembling fingers. Harland stepped inside, removing his hat and brushing dust off his coat. "No tracks," he said. "No riders. Looks clear." Mira let out a breath she'd been holding for far too long. "Good," she whispered. "I kept the door locked." "You did right," Harland said, glancing toward her with quiet approval. She noticed tension in his jaw, subtle but unmistakable, as if his mind was still combing through possibilities. "Did you leave anyone behind?" she asked hesitantly. "Family. Someone waiting." Harland shook his head. "No family left. No one expecting me anywhere." He paused. "I didn't bring you here because someone else needed me to. I brought you because leaving you there wasn't something I could live with." Mira lowered her gaze, her breath softening. The loneliness in his words revealed a truth she hadn't asked for but felt deeply. "Sit," Harland said gently, pulling a wooden crate onto the table. Inside were herbs, scraps of fabric, and a small tin of salve. "Let me look at those bruises. If they're left alone, they'll ache worse by nightfall." Mira hesitated, her body tensing out of habit. For too long, hands reaching toward her meant pain, but Harland didn't move closer. He waited, patient and calm. After a moment, Mira approached and sat in the chair across from him. "Just tell me what to do," she said softly. Harland nodded. "Lift the shirt enough so I can see the bruising. I won't touch you until you say it's all right." She raised the fabric slightly, revealing dark marks along her ribs. Harland's jaw tightened, though his expression stayed composed. "Looks painful," he murmured, "but not broken." She nodded, giving permission with a quiet, "Go ahead." He dipped 2 fingers into the salve and applied it with the lightest touch possible. Mira flinched, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar gentleness. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "It's just different." When he finished, she lowered the shirt and exhaled slowly, the air shaking with relief she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said. "You're safe here," he repeated. The words struck her deeply, not as reassurance, but as something solid she could lean on. Moments later, Harland stood and checked the lock on the door again, a habitual motion. "Next," he said softly, "we let you heal." Mira watched him with a quiet ache she didn't know how to name. The word "together" from earlier echoed faintly inside her, warming a place that had been cold far too long. The hours passed gently. Harland cooked a simple broth and brought it to her. She sipped slowly, her breaths easing with the warmth. When she finished, she set the bowl aside. "When was the last time someone cooked for you?" Harland shrugged faintly. "Probably the same time someone cooked for you." Mira paused, understanding him in a way that required no further explanation. They were 2 people who had survived different storms, yet carried the same quiet scars. Mira's gaze drifted to the crate of sewing materials beneath the table. "You kept fabric and tools here," she said softly. "Do you still use them?" Harland shook his head. "My cousin did. I kept them because throwing them out didn't feel right." She lifted a piece of cloth delicately, her fingers moving with an instinctive familiarity. "I could mend my dress," she said, "or at least make it decent again." Harland nodded. "If you feel strong enough." She sat straighter, the decision giving her a flicker of confidence. "I want to," she said, "doing something with my hands. It reminds me of who I was before." Harland heard the truth beneath her words and didn't try to soften it. "All right," he said. "I'll bring out the rest." He knelt and gathered the materials, placing them gently on the table. Mira threaded a needle slowly, her grip careful but determined. For the first time in months, her hands worked not in desperation, but with purpose. She began stitching, her breaths rhythmic, her focus narrowing to each careful pull of the thread. While she worked, Harland stepped outside to chop wood. The steady thunk of the axe echoed through the quiet valley. Every few minutes, Mira glanced through the doorway, watching him instinctively, not because she feared he would disappear, but because she was not accustomed to being left unguarded in safety. Harland moved with deliberate strength, each swing measured. She had seen many men display power loudly, violently, carelessly. Harland displayed it quietly, as though strength was a tool, not a threat. As she sewed, the torn neckline of her dress gradually became whole again, imperfect, but hers. And with each stitch, she felt something else mending too, a fragile piece of herself she thought she had lost forever. When Harland returned with the last piece of chopped wood, Mira looked up. "Did you always plan to stay out here alone?" she asked gently. He rested the axe against the wall and shrugged. "No. But after my cousin died, quiet felt easier than company." Mira pressed the newly sewn fabric flat, absorbing his words with a quiet sadness. "If I blame myself for everything that happened to me," Mira said softly, "I'd never move again." Harland paused, regarding her thoughtfully. "Maybe both of us learned to carry too much alone," he said. A warmth she wasn't prepared for stirred inside her. Recognition, understanding. Harland walked back outside to repair the stable yard. Mira hesitated only a moment before following with her sewing. "Would it be all right if I sat outside?" she asked quietly. "Being shut in, it makes my head spin." Harland scanned the valley, then nodded. Stay on the porch where I can see you. She smiled faintly and settled into a bench near the wall. The sunlight warmed her face, and she closed her eyes briefly, savoring a sensation she hadn't felt in months. Calm. Harland worked only a short distance away, lifting rails, resetting posts, his movements sure. Mira watched him through the loose fall of her hair, her needle pausing mid-stitch. She wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Harland, why didn't you walk away in the saloon? He rested a hand on a fence post, considering the truth. Because when you looked at me, you weren't begging. You looked like someone who was done fighting alone. Her needle stilled completely. No one ever saw that before, she said softly. Harland looked at her, his voice steady. Then they weren't looking. The sun dipped lower across the valley as Harland hammered the final nail into the fence rail. The rhythmic clinks faded into the quiet dusk, leaving only the soft rustle of grass and the distant call of a bird settling for the night. Mira stood nearby, leaning gently against the post, the oversized shirt hanging loosely around her, still too big, but no longer foreign. Her repaired dress rested folded beside her, a small symbol of the life she was trying to reclaim. Harland brushed the dust from his hands and glanced at her. How's the pain? He asked softly. Duller, she said. Still there, but manageable. She traced her fingers lightly over her ribs. Your salve helped. Harland nodded. We'll put more on tonight. A silence followed, warm and steady. Mira's gaze drifted to the horizon. I keep expecting to wake up back in that saloon, she whispered. The quiet feels unreal. Harland rested a hand on the fence rail. The quiet is real, he said. So is your freedom. Before she could reply, a rustle came from the direction of the creek, soft but sharp enough to snap both their attention toward the sound. Harland turned immediately, posture shifting from calm to alert. Mira's heart jolted. She stepped closer to him without thinking. Harland raised a hand, signaling her to stay back as he scanned the darkening slope. Another sound came, a splash, faint but deliberate. Mira's voice trembled. That's not a deer. Inside, Harland murmured. Bolt the door. She hesitated, fear locking her feet, but the urgency in his eyes pushed her into motion. She backed toward the cabin, watching the creek the entire time. Harland moved down the slope, every step silent, his hand hovering near the revolver at his hip. As he neared the brush, the splashing stopped. He approached cautiously and then spotted something slumped beside the water. A man, face down, half submerged in the shallow stream. Harland nudged him with his boot. The man groaned, weak and feverish. His shirt was torn, his face bruised, his breath thready. Mira cracked open the door, her knuckles white on the frame. "Who is it?" she called softly. Harland knelt beside the stranger, turning him just enough to check for weapons. Finding none, he felt for a pulse. Weak, but present. "He's alive," Harland said. "Barely." The man's cracked lips moved. "Help. Water." Mira stepped closer despite her fear. "He looks worse than I did." "Don't come too close yet," Harland warned gently. "Not until I know why he's here." The stranger tried to lift his head, but his strength failed. "They chased me," he croaked. "Dustwater men, after the fight. They're coming." Mira's breath froze. "Chased? For what?" Harland steadied the man. "Who chased you? Names." The man swallowed painfully. "Garrison, and the other brother. They want her back." Mira's heart dropped, her knees weakening. The world she had run from was already trying to reclaim her. Harland's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed calm. He lifted the man and carried him toward the cabin. "Mira," he said, "open the door." She did, hands shaking violently. Harland laid the wounded man near the stove, covering him with a blanket. Mira hovered nearby, her voice trembling. "They're coming for me!" Harland turned toward her, his voice quiet but absolute. "They won't reach you." He walked to the corner and retrieved a wooden box Mira hadn't noticed before. Inside lay a second revolver, spare cartridges, and an old maintenance cloth. Mira's breath caught as she watched him load the gun with controlled precision. "You're preparing for a fight," she whispered. I'm preparing for whatever comes, he corrected. Dustwater men don't ride this far unless they're desperate. Mira felt her ribs tighten from fear. They'll bring guns. So will I, Harland said calmly. And they don't know this valley the way I do. She swallowed. What if they outnumber you? Harland met her gaze directly. Then they'll learn numbers don't matter out here. A tremor shook through her. You're risking your life because of me. I'm keeping you safe, he said. That's not risk. It's right. Mira stepped toward him, her fear tangled with something deeper. I don't want anything to happen to you, she whispered. Harland softened, the edge in his posture easing. I'll come back to you, he said quietly. Before she could respond, a distant shout echoed from the ridge, followed by the crack of a branch. Mira gasped, instinctively gripping Harland's arm. He moved to the window, scanning the dim slope. 2 riders, he said. They found the valley but not the cabin. Panic clawed at her chest. What do we do? We keep the lamp low, he said. And if they get too close, I'll draw them away. No, she said quickly, fear spilling into her voice. They'll shoot you. Not if I choose the route, Harland replied. They can't catch what they can't see. Please don't go alone, she begged. He turned to her fully, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. I'm not leaving you. I'm leading them away only if I must. And I'll come back. A weak voice rose from the floor. They won't stop, Bram murmured. They think she belongs to them. Harland's expression hardened. No one owns her. He slung the second revolver into his belt and checked the door one last time. Mira's breath quickened. She stepped close, gripping his shirt at the chest. Come back to me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't disappear out there. Harland lifted her chin gently with a calloused hand. You're not alone, he murmured. Not now, not ever. The closeness between them tightened, a fragile moment built on trust and fear. Mira rose onto her toes and pressed her lips softly to his. Slow, pleading, certain. Harland kissed her back without hesitation, the warmth grounding her in a world that had been cold for far too long. Her hands clenched his shirt as though anchoring him to the promise he'd made. When she pulled back, she whispered, Come back. I will, he said, and she believed him. Harland stepped outside into the deepening dusk, closing the door softly behind him. Mira bolted it and pressed her ear to the wood, listening to the faint crunch of his boots and the metallic click of his rifle. Moments later, a shout rang across the ridge. Then another. Mira's heart pounded so hard she had to grip the table to stay upright. She heard Harland's whistle, a sharp, practiced signal, and then the thunder of hoofbeats racing across the valley floor. She dropped to her knees, her breath shuddering. Bram stirred weakly. He'll lose them, the wounded man whispered. He knows this land. They don't. Mira wiped away her tears. He promised he'd come back. He will, Bram murmured, before drifting into sleep. Time crawled painfully. The lamp flickered. The cabin walls felt too thin to hold her fear. Mira sat by the window, knife in hand, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Every heartbeat felt like a lifetime. Then, at last, she heard the steady, familiar rhythm of Harland's horse returning. Not frantic, not chased, steady, controlled, alive. Mira unbolted the door with shaking hands and stepped outside just as Harland rode into the clearing. He swung down from the saddle and landed firmly on his feet. Before he could say a word, she ran to him, throwing her arms around him with all the strength she had left. He caught her, lifting her slightly off the ground, pulling her into his chest. She pressed her face into him, tears streaming freely. I told you, he murmured into her hair. I'd come back. She clung to him desperately. Are they gone? Lost them near the ridge, he said. They'll never find their way back here. She pulled back just enough to see his face, her own trembling with relief. Then it's over. It's over, he confirmed. You're safe. We're safe. The weight of those words settled between them. Final, steady, real. Harland brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch gentle as ever. Mira leaned into it, her breath warm against his hand. Stay, she whispered. Not because you feel responsible. Stay because you want to. Harland cupped her face with both hands, leaning his forehead lightly against hers. "I wanted to from the moment you looked at me in that saloon," he whispered. Her breath hitched, a soft sound full of emotion she had buried for too long. She kissed him again, slow and certain, and he returned it with a quiet intensity that ignited something warm and entirely new between them. He lifted her into his arms effortlessly, carrying her toward the cabin as the night settled gently around them. For the first time in years, Mira walked into a home, not as property, not as a burden, but as someone who had been chosen. Harland closed the door behind them, sealing out the darkness and danger that once held her captive. For the first time in a very long time, neither of them was alone. They had chosen each other, and the future waiting quietly on the other side of fear.